get a little background on those of you in the room. How many of you have online programs that are already doing clinical externship, internship, field work? We all use different words, but okay, so some. How many of you are wanting to start that? Okay, and of those that are wanting to start it, are you a little intimidated by the process? No? Yeah? Okay, thank you for being honest. And the smiling face in the front row. Okay, it's a tough nut to crack, right? Because we have a lot of different things that happen within clinicals. Other quick survey question here. How many of you are in health-related professions? So allied health, nursing. Okay, how many are in business? Business, IT? None? Okay, so we've got a few health and a few business and IT. Where's everybody else from? Oh, social work, yeah, that's a good one.
Education.
Education.
ASL interpreting.
Ooh, that's a really interesting one. Interpreting. Nobody else wants to fess up? Okay. I asked that question because it's really important as we talk about this that context plays into it. And I'm just going to be really upfront with you. My experience is mostly health science, nursing, and psychology, so more health-related professions. Doing these kinds of programs and managing them in something like business, CJ, those kinds of things is really different. And part of the reason it's really different is because you're not as highly regulated as we are in healthcare. So I want to be upfront about that. I think the same principles can apply, but luckily those of you in business and CJ can probably water it down a little bit. Those of us in healthcare have a lot more rules around what we do. Okay? So this was going to be a working session. You all have been sitting all day, and my goal was to make you not sit. However, there are a lot of you. And only one of me. So I need to ask 4 different people to not sit and come be my helpers. And I am a teacher. I will call on you if no one volunteers. Thank you, ladies. Sure. And one more brave soul.
I'll help you out.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give you each a pad and a marker. This is audience participation. I will accept nothing less. I'm a teacher. Active learning is what happens, right? That's how we get places in life. Passive learning doesn't work out well for us. Okay, so let's start with when we have a clinical or an externship. I'm just going to say clinical. Can we all just agree that it's like means the same thing as everything else? Clinical is the word I'm used to. Okay, who are our stakeholders? If we're getting ready to implement a clinical in a program, who are the stakeholders in that clinical?
Preceptors.
Okay, so the clinical facilities, can one of you write that just at the top of your page? Yeah.
Clinical facility.
Clinical facilities, yep. Okay, somebody else said the most important word that kind of gets overlooked sometimes. Students. Can you put that at the top of your page?
Faculty.
Okay, and I'm going to broaden that out a little bit. Faculty or the program.
University.
Huh? They are fine Sharpies, aren't they? You can't see any of it, can you, what they're writing? It's too... Okay, somebody else said something?
The University Legal Department.
Okay, university. If you put that on there, I might have to rip one of these off and have one more person come write for me because I have one more in my head. You guys haven't come up with yet. Thank you. That's exactly what was in my head. So let's take this faculty one off and stick it up here, if you would. Except I moved the laptop over here, so let me give you. Can you do that without tripping yourself? Okay, thank you. Can I get one more person to come write for me? Okay, you said university and regulatory, so you win. I'm going to broaden that out a little bit to accreditation and regulation. Did I spell accreditation right? I think so. My students always used to laugh at me because I get so busy talking and writing on the board that I would spell things wrong. we have to, when we're designing our processes and our programs, we have to meet the needs of all of these groups, right? And sometimes the needs differ, right? I'll pick on regulatory. Anybody a regulator in here before I start talking? Okay, I can pick on regulatory folks. The needs of the regulators and the guidelines that they put in place sometimes are contraindicated to the needs of the university, the program, or the students, and sometimes the clinical facilities, right? So we have to think about all of these, and we have to take them all into consideration when we get ready to do our planning. So let's start shouting some things out for our clinical facilities. And remember, that's broad. Could be your externship, your business, wherever. What kinds of needs do they have when they take a student?
Liability.
Okay, they have liability, particularly in things like healthcare and CJ, right? Huge liability. My nurse practitioner students, oh boy, luckily we've never had an incident, but it's pretty scary. I mean, they're out tracheing and intubating patients and things like that. There's a lot of liability. So that extends not only to the clinical facilities, but also to the students, right? So if you'll add liability to that. Yep. The program and the faculty have some liability.
And to the university.
And to the university, right. The liability is different for each group, right? The clinical facilities, especially in healthcare, probably have the greatest liability, but that's pretty closely followed by the university and the program. Because as a program, if I'm turning out a student that's going to draw blood or insert a trach or do a GI tube, and they don't know how to do it right, I'm creating issues not only for my program, but also for the university. So there's a huge amount of responsibility there for us on that. Okay, what else? What other factors?
Staffing and time management.
Staffing and time management. And who do you think that impacts?
The preceptors and probably the director of the company.
Okay, so staffing and time management, again, for the clinical facilities. Anybody ever hosted a student, supervised a student that was on a clinical or an externship? Yeah, it's exhausting. And even if they're a good student, it's exhausting. Because they have needs, and you're trying to do your normal routine, your normal job, but then also meet their needs and help them learn and develop them as a professional too. So it is absolutely exhausting. What about for the students? Do you see any time management responsibilities for them? Yeah, how so?
It's like absorbing another part-time job into your already full life.
Yep. So our programs, and I'm going to keep picking on my nurse practitioner program at Purdue Global because it's our biggest one, but those students have to do 4 10-week rotations of 160 hours, 4 academic terms in a row. So if you think about that for those nurses, that's 160 hours every 10 weeks, so about 40 weeks, a little over 40 weeks with their break weeks, that they have to fit into everything else they already have going on in their lives. That's a lot of time. When I finished OT school, I had to do 6 months full-time unpaid. That's what was required. And so for a lot of our students, the time management is a big deal. The finance piece goes in there too, right? If you want to just stick the finance up there since I brought it up. Because most of us in the professions we're in, when we do these, we're not paying, and on top of it, we're paying tuition. Okay, so we're paying money out, we're working full time, and we're probably not getting anything out of it. Not concrete to pay our bills, right? The education's important, but.
Can't complete either if they don't get their clinical, so that's another huge time together.
Yeah, that's a great point. She said, if you didn't hear, she said students can't complete if they don't finish the clinicals. We have several certificate programs at Purdue Global, and I have a lot of students who will get to the end. Our MA students do 160 hours as well, and they'll get to the end and be like, well, I only got 140 hours. Sorry, you're not graduating. So they have to think about that and plan. And for our probably our graduate students, it's a matter of kind of trying to figure out how to fit in their lives. For some of more of our entry-level students, it might be that they truly just have never had to manage their time like that, so we're having to teach them those skills along with the professionalism that they need. Time management, not so much for the university probably. The staffing, time management for the program. I'm going to have you put that up there. Why?
It takes a lot of time to find candidates, place people, get the affiliation agreements signed.
Yep.
Assessment.
Track them, assess them, develop the documentation, communicate with the clinical sites, relationships. Building relationships with sites is a really long and tenuous process, and it only takes one snotty student to ruin everything you've done. Right? Really. Really. I have 2 voicemails I can play for you. Oh, I probably can't because they're on camera. But it doesn't take much. Those relationships are tenuous. Okay, so time management on the university, well, more at the program level than the university level probably, but getting the university to buy into that and the amount of time it takes for that to happen. One of the things I feel truly privileged about is that when Kaplan asked me to start this for health sciences, oh, this is recorded, I don't know how well I can say this, they kind of sort of gave me carte blanche to say, what do you need, how do you want to do this? Not really, there was oversight and they made sure that I wasn't like overstaffing. But we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to develop staffing models because again, we're not having face-to-face contact. And so it takes longer to develop those relationships because we're having to do everything phone, email. We did a lot of faxing then, I know that's kind of outdated now. But it's a really, it's always a long process to develop relationships. It's harder when you don't have the face-to-face. So you have to build that in. Just kind of give you guys an example right now. For my health sciences team, for my undergrad team, we actually secure all the placements for the students. And about our 3rd or 4th year, it leveled off that it was about 30 phone calls for every 1 placement. Okay, so 30 phone calls for what my people are supposed to do productivity-wise, that's about a day and a quarter of labor. And it really has been very, very stable. Now that includes the progress checks and all of that kind of stuff too, so it's not just setting up the site, it's all the other things that go with it. But it's a pretty intensive amount of labor to make that happen. Okay, what else? Time management, liability, finances. Ooh, let's put the finance stuff in the program. That goes with time management, right? Kind of expensive, so you've got to build your financial model out for that. We had a meeting really, really early on when we started health sciences, before we had placed even a single medical assisting student. We already had something like 700 students in the program. And I was kind of new at this point, and we were in a conference room in Fort Lauderdale, and one of the VPs came in and was doing this, health sciences is so great, you guys have so many students already, blah, blah, blah. And in the back of my head, I kept thinking, what if this whole thing doesn't work out? What if this whole MA placement thing doesn't work the way I think it's gonna? I kind of feel responsible for all of this. And unfortunately, what I was thinking came out of my mouth. And that was really not a good strategy on my part. I would not recommend that to anyone. It was kind of ugly for a day or two. And really my honest question, and to me it was an ethical issue, is what happens if we don't get these sites to fall into place the way they want? And what you'll see now is a lot of the regulatory agencies want you to show that you have sites before you're placing students. But that's a chicken and an egg issue. Because if you're just getting ready to start a program and you're not going to need placements for 2 or 3 years, you can't really get those sites to say, oh yes, 2 years from now I'll give you 5 nurse practitioner placements. Because they don't know what things are going to look like for them 2 years from now. So you have to think about that and take that into consideration and plan for it pretty carefully and coordinate that with your regulatory agency and your university and your program. So all of that kind of has to go together. What else? What other factors can you all think of?
Changing regulations.
Changing regulations. And we have regulation. Yeah. Yeah. So we have regulations on a number of levels. And again, I had the advantage when we started this. Nobody paid attention to this kind of stuff. Now they all pay attention to it. But we have regulations at a couple different levels. We have, obviously, for those of us that have regional accreditation, you've got to meet whatever you need to for your regional accreditors. You have state regulations, and for those of you familiar with the online stuff, NC-SARA, and then the states that aren't in NC-SARA have their own regulations. Depending on the programs, you may have individual state regulations. So again, not to throw nursing under the bus, but nursing is a perfect example. There's a board of nursing in every single state. And so in most of those states, you have to have permission not only from higher ed and all of those folks, but you have to have permission from boards of nursing as well. So you have to have that. And then for those of us who have outside accrediting agencies, again with nursing it's CCNE or ACN. For medical assisting it's AAMA or AMT. There's all of you, for all of your programs, have all different kinds of regulations and groups that might be involved. So you have to look at all of those regulations too. Lots of different layers to that whole accreditation thing.
Vetting and evaluating the agencies on a continual basis, because just because someone's there supervising this placement doesn't mean 2 months from now that same person will be there. Well, that agency may not be appropriate if that person has changed. They might not have the right credentials to be here.
Yep, very true.
So it's an ongoing process.
If we could add that to the faculty and program, continuing evaluation of the sites and the supervisors. And then kind of along with that, credentialing of the supervisors, again, depending on what program you're in, you may have to have specific, we have it both with psych and with nursing that the people who are supervising have to hold really, really specific credentials. So we've got to make sure we have those in place. Funny.
The university side, I've seen this increasingly, is that there's a lot of competition for clinical sites, and now you see a lot of different entities paying for clinical sites. So.
Yeah, that makes me want to lose my mind. So the university competition for sites, that affects accreditation and regulation as well. I'll talk about that here in a sec. The faculty, the competition for clinical sites, because they might have to be out there schmoozing a little bit more so that their neighbor down the street doesn't get the spot and your student gets the spot. It impacts the students. Something terrible. All of our students want to be placed in a medical clinic that's next door to their house or their work so that they don't have to drive, and they want the clinic to be open 24/7 so they can go in and do their hours whenever it works for them. That would be fabulous. It is not the world we live in. You're nursing, aren't you? I can tell. Okay, women's health and peds, specialty stuff can be really painful. The stakeholders in terms of the clinical facilities, also the competition for clinical sites has really beefed up on this. When we started all this stuff in 2007-ish, people didn't really understand online education, and so what we got a lot of times when we were contacting sites was people telling us how online education was a diploma mill and you're just handing out diplomas, and there was a lot of nastiness. I have one staff member who tells stories about how she used to cry every week because somebody would be so mean to her. We don't hear that anymore, but what makes us want to cry is, yeah, we're booked out until 2022, or we're booked out until 2021. So this competition for clinical sites is a crazy thing. It's particularly happening at the nursing level, where it's really, really tricky, and nurse practitioner. But to his point, sites have started doing a couple of things that were unheard of, even 5 years ago a lot of times. They're requiring payment. And I've seen it a little bit off and on the last 3 or 4 years. What I'm seeing more and more now is they're requiring the school to pay them. So we've gotten kind of around this in the past. With our grad students have to provide their own sites. They find them based on our guidelines, and then we approve them and whatnot. And so it was their choice. If they wanted to pay the site, they were welcome to do that. If they chose not to pay the site, then they would just need to find another site. Pretty simple solution. Well, now we've got sites coming back and saying, we think this is your responsibility as the school to make sure they have a placement, and you will pay us to take your student. And then the other crazy part of that is it's a range. Everything from $50 administrative fee to $500 per rotation is what I'm seeing. And everything in the middle. And a lot of them won't let the students set foot on the grounds until the payment's made. So you have to think about this. That goes back to your university and your program too, because there's a financial implication with that, right?
As you start to move into that world, I'm just trying to understand this, that do you transfer some of that liability to them now that they're receiving payment for service?
The liability pretty much stays the same, at least in our contracts and stuff. We haven't seen that that's changed, and I haven't heard that from our lawyers, but that's a really good question. If they're being paid for the service, maybe they should be held more accountable. But that would be nice too.
Can I throw in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Flip side of this coin about competition for our ASL, American Sign Language interpreting students, if they don't live in an area or an abundance of certified mentors, they have a hard time finding a place to do it. So we're not so much competition, it's just lack of availability.
Yeah, and we have, our programs vary for our rules based on this, but with my undergrad health sciences, because we secure their sites for them, we tell them they have to be prepared to travel up to 60 miles and further if necessary. And for some of our students, that's a real hardship. And I get that. I don't want to demean the students when I talk about this, but the reality for us is we cannot force any medical facility to take a student. And we can't force any medical facility to provide the students what they need for their experience. So if we don't have sites that are willing, we just have to keep pushing that radius out. And that's really literally how we do our searches. We start in like a 20, 30 mile radius and then keep moving out. Here's the other crazy thing about that is that it depends on what area you live in. Like New York City is the one that is always a thorn in our side. If you go 10-mile radius in New York City, you've sometimes got students commuting a couple hours. Or if you go 10-mile radius or a 60-mile radius in Des Moines, Iowa, they're going, 15, 20 minutes. And well, maybe not 15 or 20. But 60-mile radius, they could be there in 45 minutes. So that's the other thing you have to kind of think about is how that works. I had this classic story. We had a student in Utah, one of our very first placements. We placed her. We were so proud. She was like our third person we had placed. And so we're like really proud of ourselves every time we get a student placed at this point. We hadn't bothered to look at the map and realized we'd placed her on the other side of the canyon from where she lived. And she could not jump the canyon to get to her clinical site. She's very short-sighted about that. Seattle is another big one. The ferries. We've had to learn over time that if a student has to take the ferry across, the ferry runs on a schedule, the ferry's expensive. So we have to make sure we place the person on the side where the ferry is, or that we're talking to them about the fact we're not going to be able to do that.
Do you manage admission to the programs based upon the placements that you have?
We do not.
So what happens if a student, if you have more students?
So I'm going to go back to knocking on things here. We don't have a choice. We have to find them a placement. So what happens is that we start, like I said, in that short radius, and then we expand it out. But we've been literally placing students since 2007. We've never had a student we absolutely could not place. We've always been able to work something out. I'm sorry, what?
In New York, you're a nurse practitioner?
Not nurse practitioner. We're not approved in New York yet in nurse practitioner. So, and again, we've got all levels of programs. Some of them where we don't have state approvals, then we're limited, and we obviously aren't providing them there. The one thing we run into with nurse practitioner is students want to jump state lines, and if we're not approved in that state, they can't jump state lines, and they get really angry about that.
Do you let students have their clinicals at places they're currently working?
It varies by program. So for our undergrad health sciences, yeah, not a big deal. And even for psych, really not a big deal. It's trickier with nursing. And most of the time with nursing, if we've got an RN who's going to be an NP, their role as an RN wouldn't be appropriate for their NP clinical anyway. So they can sometimes be within that system, but they're maybe placed somewhere else. A lot of employers don't like to do that. And there's a couple reasons why. Number one is liability. So if that employee is there as a student, they are still liable as the employer. Okay, even if that individual's functioning as a role of a student. So that creates some concerns because of some dual roles. And then the other thing is the dual role. If you have somebody who is at their employer doing clinical for something separate and they're not successful, it gets really ugly. My personal preference most of the time is to try to avoid the employer, but it's also not realistic. Because if you've got, again, medical assisting is a great example. If you have somebody who's an on-the-job trained medical assistant and they're maybe just going through the program so they can get their professional credential, why wouldn't we let them be with their employer? Let them sign off on their skills, let them do what they need to do to get their employee to the level where they need them. So it's kind of situational, but for our random students that we're just placing in places, we're pretty careful about the employer thing. Because a lot of times it turns ugly.
And then a follow-up to that, how do you ensure that the student is actually completing what the employer signs off on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have, can you add affiliation agreements to the accreditation regulation and to the university and to the faculty? So we have legal agreements, affiliation agreements, probably all your schools use them, and the responsibilities are outlined there. With our programs where we have really specific hands-on training, medical assisting and nurse practitioner in particular, the person who is going to be the supervisor actually has to submit their credentials to us, and we verify their credentials as well, because we want to make sure that whoever's training them has the background to be training them. And in both those cases, they have to sign an agreement, a separate agreement from the affiliation agreement, saying that they know their training and hands-on skills and acknowledging that they're willing to do that. And then they're held to the standards in that document that they sign. So for like medical assisting, we have it literally lists every single thing that's required, and then they have to complete a certain number of recommended skills, and that's all listed and the supervisor signs off on them. On my undergrad side, where we're securing the sites for the students, the staff that work, I have it split. So I have staff that works directly with the sites and staff that work directly with the students. The staff that work directly with the sites, their minimum performance expectations is that they secure 6 sites a week. So then my projected placement numbers, that's where I build my staffing ratio. The student numbers are more flexible. Honestly, they've handled cohorts, the people in those positions have handled cohorts of up to 400 and 500 students, because their role really is just collecting the preclinical documentation and making sure that the students are ready to go and understand expectations. So their labor intensiveness is real different than the people securing the sites. I expected when we started this that our ratios would go down. I told you we had that 1 to 30 ratio, or for every 30 is 1 placement. I expected those would go down over time, and they really haven't. And I think that's partially because of the increased competition for sites and increased online programs out there. Yep. Go ahead, in the back there. No, go ahead. No, go.
How do you determine where to build or develop these relationships? Is it based on your enrollments, based on like population? What are the factors?
Great question. Our students are all required to apply for placement, depending on the program, 3 to 6 months before they need placement at their clinical site. And those applications are their notification to us that they're going to need our support. And then that's where we look for placements. So we have some of you who are familiar with SharePoint, we're still kind of back in the dark ages with some of this stuff, and we have a SharePoint list. We call it our placement by term list, and we look at that every time. Fabulous news is that there are a lot of software tracking systems out there now for clinicals. If those of you who are kind of looking at getting into this, I would highly recommend using a clinical tracking system. If you just Google clinical tracking systems, there's all kinds of cool stuff that comes up. If you have specific questions for me and you want to ask me later, I'll tell you, but I don't want to endorse any product publicly right now because this is on camera. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there just wasn't there when we first started building our systems. We're actually in the process of converting, so actually by the end of next month, I'll have all my programs and software tracking systems, and we'll get rid of SharePoint, which is a happy thing. And black and white, you had?
Do you do the research and the writing and posting of the disclosures for the students on your website? Or is that another?
So posting of the disclosures for what?
Except for the compliance issues
Okay.
by state.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we do. We have those posted. We also have in all of our programs clinical student agreements that the students have to sign off on, and it goes through each one of those. And for any program that has a clinical, when they enroll in the university, they have to sign off and acknowledge that they understand the requirements.
Is that your office with your training staff doing the work, the research, the writing?
So we have a legal team that manages all the state-by-state requirements, and that all gets published at the university level. Anything that's program or clinical requirement, my team writes it, and then it goes through legal review. And so I can't require students to sign anything unless about 500 people have reviewed it and approved it first. 500 might be a little overestimation, but not too much.
My question was similar. I'm just thinking about on the student side of, like, if you have a DACA student or if you have students who will need to pass background checks and like knowing, a lot of times students don't understand,
Right.
you know, the requirements, and for DACA, like for licensure, essentially, like they could get all the way through a program and then realize they can't practice in their state because of requirements.
Right.
So who works with each individual student on issues like that?
Great question. So she was asking about like DACA and background checks and things like that.
Like social security numbers, like you
Right.
have to have one. you know, things like
So for students who enroll in our programs, they do have to sign off when they enroll in the program that it's their responsibility to check out licensure requirements and things like that. We counsel and guide them, right, because we don't want to mislead them in any way, but it is ultimately their responsibility. And with a lot of our programs, it's really different from state to state. Psychology addictions is a great example of that. Like, it's wildly different from place to place. So it really is the student's responsibility to make sure they've looked at that. And we tell them that during the process and then guide them if they need that guidance. In terms of background checks, all of our programs where a student has a clinical or an externship component, they're required to pass a background check at admissions, and then for a lot of the programs, they have to pass it again before they're placed at the clinical site. And I have the lovely privilege of managing that whole process for the university too. And the reason I do that is because it ties into the clinicals, and I like to have control.
Is it background or is it just agency specific? If the agency requested that?
No, we have university criteria. It's set by school and program, and those are published to the students so that they know what those criteria are going to be.
Second one before.
Yeah, our nursing students and health sciences students do rechecks before we place them at sites, just to make sure they're clear. Most healthcare facilities are going to require that anyway.
Do you do continuing ed for ongoing, because most of these programs require additional hours for licensure?
We do not. So back in the day, we were this thing called Kaplan University, and Kaplan had its own division called Kaplan Continuing Ed. And so it was a territory thing. Like, we are only the university and we are only credit degree granting people, and these people are continuing ed. We have not done any of that in the past. I hope in the future maybe we'll be able to do some of it, but right now we haven't.
Do you run a clinical mental health counseling online?
No counseling, no. Some of the programs where there's really specific state licensure outside of nursing, we just don't get into because it's too difficult. Surge Tech is one that comes up all the time when I'm out and about. People always want Surge Tech, which is a fabulous and awesome program, but it is so heavily regulated at the state level, it would be a nightmare for us to try to figure that out.
What were the greatest barriers that you encountered when you first launched your online programs?
I'm sorry, what was the beginning of that?
The most difficult barrier.
Most difficult barrier? Figuring it out. Nobody was doing it at that point. Nobody else had done it. So figuring it out, figuring out how to make it work, what we were gonna need for staffing. We did a lot of, we did everything in spreadsheets, and we would email spreadsheets around every day, which was completely inefficient and didn't work after there were more than 2 of us. So it was just a lot of figuring it out, and then figuring out not only how to make it work from a big picture level, but also at a university level. A couple of things I would say. Number one, Really, really, really clear expectations for the students. And I would highly recommend you have them sign off on those clear expectations. Because again, if you're managing this online and you don't have those face-to-face relationships, it's not as easy as pulling Johnny or Susie or Sally into your office and looking them in the eye and being like, you are being a complete pain in the rear, right? You can't do that as easily with these students. And when you do it over the phone, somehow it takes on a totally different tone. So clear expectations that are communicated multiple times to the students and keep it in front of them all the time. My dissertation research was actually on virtual teams, and the literature shows that, especially in virtual relationships, you have to communicate the same information over and over and over and over again. It's not a one-time thing. So I would make sure you do that, and I would do the same with the clinical sites. Really, really clear, documented expectations that you have them sign off on. Because again, you can't just stop by Dr. Jones's office and be like, hey doc, we got an issue here. So you want to make sure that you have that stuff really well outlined. Good documentation of everything. I am the queen of SOPs, and my team has a whole SOP thing that we follow. It's in SharePoint too. But we have a SharePoint, and it's a wiki. And sometimes they'll come to me and say, hey Trish, what are we doing about this? I don't know, what's the SOP say?
What is an SOP?
Standard operating procedure. And I would keep everything, if you haven't all figured out, I'm a little bit type A, but I would keep everything really, really well documented, because that's important for your liability. If a student comes back and accuses you of not finding them a site, or not working to find them a site in the right location, or we never really have sites accuse us of anything. It's usually more students if there's accusations. But having everything really well documented with your online students, I would keep documents of every interaction you have with every clinical site and with every student. Those clinical management software programs that I talked about have a great way of doing that. And so my staff, whenever they have a conversation, whenever they send an email, it gets copied into that log, and we have that information. The great thing about that then is you've got the documentation, but you can also pull reports really quick. Like if I need to know how many complaints I've had that month, I can pull my complaint logs and take a look and see if there's patterns, look and see if it's a pattern about a certain staff member, about a certain site. All of those kinds of things are easily trackable. So I think that's one of the cool things about the online processes. If you have everything really well documented, you should have yourself pretty well covered, because you've always got that information.
So you deal with all problems remotely?
Yeah. Yeah, and just to say it again, we don't ever have face-to-face contact with our students. We never, ever, well, at graduation, we see them, but we don't ever see them before then. And to be pretty clear too, most of the time I don't have contact with my staff. I do see some of them occasionally, but I have people who've worked for me for as long as 8 or 10 years, and I've never ever met them. So it's all phone, webinar, all that kind of thing.
So are you doing supervision, or are faculty doing supervision virtually, or are you hiring preceptors locally, or both?
We do everything virtually. So in terms of interacting with the clinical sites, it's all virtual. We don't do site visits. Everything's phone calls. We have had a couple of times where we've done visits because we have somebody in the area, or we had one particular challenging situation where we flew somebody out because of the nature of the situation. So we have those opportunities if we really, really need to, but we don't do it on a routine basis.
One quick question. So you mentioned your team isn't centered where you are, so you hired a remote team, and you all together in a remote capacity are able to build these processes and flow charts and everything.
Yeah, and that's why I think a clinical management software system is really important. Something that's transparent. Again, I'll get back up on my dissertation soapbox here for a moment. But the success of virtual teams is based on transparency. Transparency in documentation, transparency in communication. So everything we do is documented. And the great thing about those clinical management systems is if I have somebody send me a complaint, which I get the complaints, right? Students don't email me and say, oh, we're really happy, we love what your team's doing. I get the complaints. first thing I can do is go in that software system and bring everything up and see what's happened. So that transparency is just critical.
What is the system you're using? You said SharePoint?
We use SharePoint for tracking stuff. Our system that we use, I'm not endorsing any specific product, I'm just telling you what we use. We use something called Core Elms. Used to be called RX Preceptor. Great product. Castle Branch has a product called Bridges that I think is also a pretty good product. Typhon for nurses is pretty common, and there are a bunch of others out there.
So it's actually clinical tracking while they're in the field, but you can also put in notes before they get placed. Is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Is there a section in that you're able, if you're talking to your clinical precepting sites, you can build your data?
Yep, you can build it on sites, you can build it on students. Our students upload all their documentation right into that system so that we're not sending stuff back and forth in email. So again, it's transparent. If I have somebody that's out sick or on vacation, we just open up the system and everything's right there. The other super awesome thing that I love is electronic time tracking. They actually log in and log out through their system, and all their stuff is figured. Right now, my health sciences staff check timesheets and manually add stuff up, and what a waste of time for people who have master's degrees, right, is to check up on these timesheets. So it's all automated.